Euranet Plus Panorama is a weekly review of European news broadcast by our network of EU radio stations.
Welcome back to Euranet Plus Panorama. Tuesday the 19th of November marked 1,000 days of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This has provided pause for thought across the European Union and the Euranet Plus network. One thing's for sure, the war has not been as one-sided as many in Europe feared, or as Putin hoped. Indeed, Poland's Foreign Minister, Radosław Sikorski, believes that the Kremlin has been left with egg on its proverbial face. Far from securing victory in a matter of days, Moscow has been forced to turn to Iran and North Korea for military equipment and even men on the ground.
The world thought Russia had a world-class military, and I have the impression that Vladimir Putin thought he had a world-class military. Now he is fighting with tanks from the 1950s. He lost the war at sea. Ukraine is dealing painful and bloody blows to the Russian army. Yes, there have been Pyrrhic victories on land, but with this level of losses, Russia must be running out of soldiers. Otherwise, they wouldn't be bringing them in from North Korea.
Unfortunately, says newly appointed Lithuanian Defence Minister Dovilė Šakalienė to Žinių Radijas, Russia is not the only party to have been taken by surprise.
The most important lesson learned is that the West was not and is not prepared for a conventional war. Sadly, we are still lagging behind in terms of our defence industry, resources and capabilities, and we continue to operate as if it were peacetime. While we have stepped things up, the pace is still insufficient. On a positive note, from a global perspective, Russia, China, Iran and North Korea have not been able to break the unity of the West over the last 3 years, although they have certainly put a lot of effort and a lot of money into it, and they continue to act effectively.
Indeed, Velisa Shalamanov, Bulgaria's former defence minister, tells BNR that the recent introduction of North Korean soldiers marks a serious escalation of the crisis.
Faced with this type of escalation from Russia, it is clear that the processes in NATO and the EU are slower, and there are countries that can further slow them down and block them. So the role of alliances will be important. One such alliance in Europe is emerging between France, the UK and Poland. I hope that not only Germany, but also Romania and Bulgaria will join such an alliance at some point, because this is the strongest tool we have for deterring Russian aggression.
On Tuesday, day 1000 of the conflict, Romanian PM Marcel Ciolacu met NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte in Brussels, says Radio Romania. Ciolacu stated after the meeting that Bucharest welcomes the ongoing presence of NATO troops in Romania, as a unified show of force is required to ward off the Russian threat to the whole region.
The violations of the Allied airspace and the aggressive posture of Russia in the Black Sea show how important it is to increase the forces in the area and to offer a solid and united response of the alliance. In this context, I conveyed to the Secretary-General that Romania understands and respects its commitments and stands in solidarity with our allies and partners.
The same day, the foreign ministers of Poland, France, Germany, Italy, Spain and the UK met in Warsaw to express solidarity with Ukraine. After the meeting, Radosław Sikorski stressed that European countries need to show willing when it comes to NATO if they want to secure an ongoing commitment from the second Trump administration.
We agreed that Europe must take more responsibility for its own security, including through more balanced burden sharing in the North Atlantic Alliance. Strengthening European defence capabilities should go hand in hand with maintaining the US commitment to our security.
This week, US President Joe Biden, in what is seen as a last-ditch attempt to get Ukraine in the strongest possible negotiating position before his successor takes over, gave Ukraine the green light to use US-supplied tactical ballistic missiles to attack military targets in Russia. These missiles reach supersonic speeds and have a maximum range of 300 kilometres, reports RTV Slovenia. Yet Ivailo Ivanov, a security expert at the Bulgarian NGO Aura Atlantic, which works in the security and defence field, describes Biden's decision to launch these long-range missiles as the most minimal response to Russia's New Deal with North Korea. BNR reports.
When Europe failed to react to the presence of North Korean soldiers on Russian territory and their involvement in the conflict, this was the moment Europe irreversibly embarked on a path of declining geopolitical influence. Because what had we said? We had argued for a long time that such a move would constitute a serious escalation of the conflict. And what did we do? Absolutely nothing.
Lithuania's Dovile Šakalienė agrees that this recent move on the part of President Biden falls short of the mark.
This decision will increase the morale of Ukraine's soldiers as it represents another boundary being crossed. However, considering the restrictions imposed on this decision, we remain within the realm of too little too late and still limited. A 300-kilometre strike is not a tool for strategic advantage. It will affect the real logistics of the Russian Federation, but it is not a decisive measure. Furthermore, I agree with President Zelensky that certain information should not be made public. Now that the targets have been identified, their relocation is assured.
Major Jānis Slaidins of the Latvian National Guard tends to concur. He suggests in an interview with Latvia's radio that if this response had come earlier, things may have turned out differently.
We see that the war has dragged on, 1,000 days. If this help from the West had been more active in 2022 or 2023, when Ukraine launched a counterattack, perhaps the situation would be different.
And of course, there's a risk that this new, heavier-handed approach from the West may actually escalate the conflict. This is certainly the line Donald Trump is likely to take when he seizes the reins in January. The US president-elect has vowed to end the war in just 24 hours, presumably by negotiating a ceasefire. But Slovenian defence expert and former Renew Europe MEP Klemen Grošelja does not want Europe to let Washington dictate the course of events.
What needs to be emphasized here is that the West and the European Union, especially the European Union, must clearly define how to end this crisis in Ukraine. To do so, we must proceed from the reality on the battlefield of international relations, taking into account the international context, notably the incoming Trump administration and, last but not least, the expectations of China, which, let's not forget, is an important player in this whole tragedy.
Mati Marsikas, Executive Director of the European External Action Service, was formerly the EU's ambassador to Ukraine. He explains to Kuku Radio why the Ukrainian people do not even want to hear mention of a ceasefire.
Ukrainians know Russia better than we do. Volodymyr Zelensky and the entire Ukrainian people know very well that if the guns fell silent today, then the Russians would possess all of the ground under their soldiers' boots, and the rest would be up for negotiation. A ceasefire today would mean a very high risk of losing territories. 4 in 5 Ukrainians are against any territorial concessions, so President Zelensky, as a democratic leader, has no choice but to continue fighting as long as Western support persists.
But with a view to some kind of de-escalation, at the end of last week, on the 15th of November, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz picked up the phone and called the Kremlin. His conversation with President Putin lasted around an hour and earned him a lot of stick, in particular from the Baltic states.
No phone calls are making our positions stronger. We need to act unified, we need to coordinate. This call was not coordinated between allies.
That was Margus Tsarkna, Estonia's foreign minister, speaking on the fringes of the foreign ministers' meeting on Monday. And Lithuania's Gabrielius Landsbergis goes further still, reports AMS.
Peace through de-escalation is a failing and failed strategy. We need a new one. We need a strategy that would come from strength. The same strategy that has been asked by Baltic states, by Ukraine itself, by others who really support Ukraine, that we need strength. And when I'm talking strength, I'm talking weapons, I'm talking about real removal of all restrictions and actually a winning strategy. From the winning strategy, we could come to a point where all the phone calls, everything would actually make sense. Because now they don't.
Chancellor Scholz, for his part, has been robust in his own defence.
In my view, it was and remains the right thing to do to talk to the Russian president now, because this much must be made clear to him. He has a responsibility. He must end the war. He must withdraw troops. He must not expect, and he must also be told this, that support for Ukraine from the countries backing Ukraine's defence campaign will wane. Germany is the country in Europe that is doing the most here.
But perhaps it's not so far-fetched for Putin to assume that support for Kyiv is on the wane. Because, following a special session in the European Parliament on Tuesday, which was attended remotely by Volodymyr Zelensky, Estonian Social Democrat MEP Marina Kaljurand lamented that the EP's support for Ukraine is visibly crumbling.
I think the debate has changed, and it has changed for the worse. And I say this because whereas before there were major political forces that were pro-European, so to speak, and supportive of Ukraine, now the order is different. The third largest political group is the Patriots, and their message was, military action must stop. It is time to start diplomatic negotiation. Peace at all costs. That is what the third largest group in the European Parliament was saying. So in that sense, the messages have changed. And the left and far right did not even turn up to hear President Zelensky speak. Yes, we know that they have always been advocates of peace at any price, not realizing that peace at any price essentially means Ukraine's surrender. The third largest group in the European Parliament was no longer dictating the terms of military aid, but ruling it out completely, saying that they did not consider it appropriate. Yet they consider diplomatic negotiations with a war criminal appropriate?
The leaders of the various European institutions and most of the other political groups in the Parliament have reiterated the EU's pledge to stand by Ukraine. However, the Patriots for Europe are not the only ones wanting to block further military aid to Kyiv. As Luxembourg's Defence Minister Eurico Baques points out to national broadcaster 100.7. Baques, who was attending the meeting of EU defence ministers in Brussels on Tuesday, decries the fact that one country, namely Hungary, is still being allowed to block EU funding for Ukraine. But she's optimistic that they may have found a way around it. Essentially, the other 26 member states will share their contributions in separate administrative arrangements instead of through the European Peace Facility.
This is truly regrettable. I think we can call a spade here. Hungary is blocking and keeps on doing so. We are talking about help that has been essential for Ukraine for a long time. There are now proposals on the table to bypass this blockage. Luxembourg supports this. It may not be the perfect solution, but it is better than not being able to provide Ukraine with any help.
So, it remains to be seen if 2025 will be the year of peace. President Zelensky said on Tuesday that he hopes it will. But not, of course, at any cost. Join us again next week for another roundup of the news from a Euranet Plus perspective.